Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, AHRD members, wherever you're joining us from. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. I hope you all are doing well. My name is Annalise Singh. I use she and they pronouns, and I am so excited to be back with AHRD. I was able to join some of you in your conference in Atlanta and just really have so much respect and admiration for all you are doing. Again, my name is Annalise Singh and look forward to being with you today. I want to thank Laura Bierma for having me in this Facebook Live. I know you have started doing these, and what a great way to stay connected during this time. I also want to thank Aaron Johnson, Rebecca Wigscheid, and Katie Pudajeski for inviting me to be here as well and to help me get started with the Facebook Live. So, a lot has happened since we all last gathered. So, I wanted to just make sure that, we kind of name everything that has been happening since we last gathered, whether it was COVID or whether it was other things that were happening. Just a lot has been going on. So I wanted to just say that from the beginning. Today we're going to be talking about racial healing. I know your organization has set up a statement related to supporting Black Lives Matter. So you all are doing a lot of good things on anti-Black racism, but I hope this conversation we have together today is one that we can make sure we continue and find deep policy and procedure changes as we go. So as we get started, I want to just remind folks that in a Facebook Live, you can send me questions. I want to hear what you want to learn. I want to be a resource for folks. And so there is a little bit of a delay from when we actually, when I get your question or comment. So if for some reason I miss your comment, please just repost it. One of the things I want to just say as we get started is an acknowledgement to the land that I work on in Atlanta, Georgia, which is unceded and stolen territory of Crete and Muskogee Indians and indigenous folks and many tribes that we don't have names for anymore. So, one of the things that I'd like you to do is to think about the land that you're working on right now. So, in terms of the land of Zoom and the land of us video conferencing, we have such an opportunity every time we talk to people is, making sure to slow down and honor and not just celebrate. We're not celebrating Indigenous land when we do land acknowledgement. We're actually setting up an acknowledgement of how anti-Black racism and white supremacy got encoded and embedded into this land we now call the United States. So just take a moment and pause and ask yourself, do I know the origin of the land that I'm doing work on right now? I know you're all on laptops or you're on your phone. But if you don't know that land, use the Google, and don't just use the Google, but then start to really learn and reteach yourself about the land that you're on. Because as we'll talk about today, white body supremacy and how white folks can take meaningful action, as Laura is asking, all those things are tied together. So I really want people to slow down. This is a time right now where we feel like, oh my gosh, we got to do everything at once. And in some ways we do. We need to, with our every breath, be very vigilant and focused, but we also need to rest and restore and learn. And so part of that is knowing the land that we're on. So I know I emphasize that a bunch, but I think when we have an understanding of the land we're on and the true history of the peoples, then I think we can start to talk about white supremacy and dismantling that in a more kind of very intentional way. So I also want to, as we get started, honor the really the righteous uprisings that are going on right now, the protest in the streets, the protest in your research, the protest of human resource development practitioner. There are multiple uprisings going on right now, and I just want to honor all of the people who've taken to the streets, but also the many of you who are taking to the streets in different ways and different, really tweaking policies and procedures that are setting up and supporting anti-Black racism to continue. And so I also want to honor the Black queer women who originated the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza, and also Opal Tometi. These are Black women, and I think that it is so important to slow down and acknowledge the land that we're on, but also to make sure that we can honor Black women and Black feminist and womanist women who've been trying to get our attention for so long, and we've ignored them for so long. So I want to give a shout out to them. I also want to acknowledge and honor the Black women and feminists and womanists over time, from Sojourner Truth, who said, "Ain't I a woman?" the first intersectional theorist and rabble rouser and just like freedom fighter, all the way to Alice Walker and Layli Phillips, who continued to develop womanism as a theory. It's a great theory to like look at as human resource development researchers, to our very current, contemporary speakers. So Brittany Cooper, Susanna Morris. I think, as my dear friend Jen Wilsey said recently, it's so important that we slow down and honor that we've been at the feet of Black women learning, and many times not learning or ignoring. But how can we honor like all of the Black scholars and community organizers, most of whom have been Black women, to honor the knowledge that they've been offering that we haven't been listening to. And so I think that gets to be a complicated thing, right? We don't want Black women to be positioned to teach us. However, I've got stacks of books all around me, and I've got lots of social media posts that are sharing resources about what Black women have shared with us for so long. So as we get started, I want to honor the land I'm on. I want to honor the very long history of Black feminists, womanists, freedom fighters. I also want to just honor all our contemporary Black women, Black communities who are have done work for so long as people of color who aren't Black, and as white people. We're catching up, right? So, I wrote a book called The Racial Healing Handbook. I hope that that has been a service. I wrote it last year for some reasons. I'll talk about why I wrote it. But again, as we get going today, my name's Annalise Singh. I hope that you put your questions and comments so that I can see you. And I see that Laura and Loy are checking in about some of some land ownership issues. So thank you so much. I'd love to hear where people are joining us from. So if you could share where you are and what land you're on, I would greatly appreciate that. And, as we get started today, I really want to just acknowledge what is going on right now and how we are all doing with this, whether we're in university or practice settings. So, for instance, some of you are just still reeling from COVID, right? Last time I joined you at your conference, we were in COVID land. And I think at the conference, we talked about something very early. We were talking about the racial and ethnic inequities in COVID and the deaths that we were going to see from COVID before they ever got reported. So I just wanted to say, and hey, David from Edinburgh, that's great to have you. But many of us, whether we're in the land called the US or we're around the world, we kind of knew what the racial ethnic disparities were around COVID. And so, we were all on what Arundhati Roy called the global pause. She wrote a great article called The Pandemic as a Portal. And what she said is during that global pause, we had and have a moment right now, which directly connects to all these righteous uprisings and to Black Lives Matter, that movement in this moment. And what Arundhati said is that we, in some ways, don't have a choice anymore. Like, we are not going to go back to a pre-COVID world. But what we do have a choice about is the world we're creating right now and the one that we're going to. And so I want to drop that into all of our minds right now about many times in human resource development, whether you're doing research, advocacy, practice, and hey, Holly and Fidelma, Peter, good to see you all checking in. Many of us were not just doing our jobs kind of like just to do them, but we were doing them in ways that we were probably begging people to bring attention to different social justice issues, inequities we would see in human resources. I see human resources as a field, as where a lot of power is situated, but also where you all can really see where those inequities kind of get laid out on Black bodies and people of color, and how white supremacy upholds those systems, right? So many of us were doing that good social justice work, but as we went into COVID, I think we had this disorientation around, okay, how do we do this work online? How do we do this work via Zoom? And so I want to hear from you all about how things are going. And Jamie, I see that is not your name, but or maybe it is, but it's good to see you. Oh, and I see some folks from Zachary, Louisiana. I'm from New Orleans, so we'll talk about that. So I want to talk to you all about racial healing today. I want to talk to you about anti-Black racism. I want to talk to you about white supremacy. We're going to talk about that. But the first thing I want to do is something that Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, does in some of her talks. And I want to slow down, and I want you to take in my face. And I want you to see my race. And I want to ask you what you see. And feel free to, comment what you see. I think this is the part where even I start still getting nervous about, wait, we're going to talk about race, right? And we have all that stuff come up. That's like, wait, I'm not supposed to comment on their race, or am I actually supposed to ask that question? Is what I'm seeing wrong? Or am I going to step into the metaphorical pile of what if I talk about it? So I'd love some brave souls. And hey, from Lawrenceville, Georgia. We got some stuff going on in Georgia, don't we? I'd love to see you all kind of put in the comment box, and dialogue me about what you see when you see my race. Because I think that when we don't slow down to really think about that, it's the number one racial healing strategy I write about in the Racial Healing Handbook, is what we see when we see people's race. We know race isn't real. We know race is a lie. It's a social construct. It was set up by colonizers in the land we now call the United States to keep people kind of hemmed in. But, I want to see my brave souls in the chat box. Tell me what you see. What do you see when you see my race, when you actually really slow down to take it in? And I'm asking you this question because I want you to think about it, whether you're doing research or whether you're, working in practice. And hey, Ann from Knoxville, my wife is from Knoxville, so I've got some love for you all up there. But when you see my race, you end up seeing me. But we are so, and maybe you see a stereotype, right, of what you see. But so many times we don't slow down to even see our own race, right? And so for me, yes, thank you, Allie, for being a brave, courageous. I see a visual disconnect that's hard to square. I see a white woman, but a surname that doesn't feel white, so it causes cognitive dissonance. Yes. Thank you, Allie, for sharing that. So, I really want us to encourage, and Karen say, I don't know what race you are, right? And so it's so important to talk about my race and your race, right? Deidre is saying a woman of color who's hard to place in a race category, right? And that has been my experience in my own race, right? Is that actually, I'm a mixed race, South Asian woman on the white side of my family. I have Scottish-Irish, mostly Scottish heritage. And on the Indian side, I'm like fully 50% Punjabi. So, I'm literally kind of half and half, right? But the embodiment of my race has been confusing in a lot of ways because I didn't really get a lot of accurate teaching about that. And you, based on your race, most likely didn't either, right? Whether you're white, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, First Nations, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, no matter where you grew up in the world, we very rarely had accurate information about race. And what does that do in human resources, whether it's research or practice or advocacy, when we're working with people? And it's so hard to even talk about what we see when it comes to race. So I'm going to talk a little more about my race because I want you all, and I'd love to hear how you experience and see your race, right? So for me, I grew up in my race learning I wasn't white enough and I wasn't Indian enough. And somehow, like, I also got the word exotic a lot, right? So it tells you when a lot of mixed race folks get that, some type of exotic, right? But even though I identify as a person of color, I also have learned over the years to really talk about being white adjacent to whiteness. I've got an Indian and a white bloodline that comes right up against one another. When I really go under the skin to my race and think about the intergenerational history that's inside of my body, on the white side, lots of colonizers, right? Colonization, big part of my white side, on my mom's side. And it's painful to think about. The more I learn about it, slave owners, actively enslaving people, just there's generational harm that's been done on the white side of my family. So then it's like, okay, wow. As I start to think about my race, I'm starting to think about history, the history of my generations. On the Indian side, there was a colonization history because the British partition of India happened, where they split India into Pakistan and India. And Sikhs and Hindus went from what's now Pakistan into India. And then Muslims went from what's now India into Pakistan. And so during that, there was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of harm witnessed. So my dad had the embodiment of a lot of trauma on his side, but then he came to the United States as what was called the brain drain of India. And then was set up in this kind of system of white supremacy, right? Where he immediately learned as a dark-skinned Indian person that you did not want to be tagged as black. Even though he was called the N-word growing up, I was called the N-word in New Orleans. We were hearing a lot of things that went along with my dad's turban and his dark skin that were ascribed to, you are not white, right? And so I'm only sharing my story to get you to think about your story, right? So there's this stuff I experienced, right, in terms of my race, in terms of how I was socialized, but there's also some privilege that comes with my skin color. There's trauma that I experienced, but there's also the privilege of I am proximal to whiteness, right? And so for white folks on in this Facebook Live session, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you and see your chats and your comments around what does it mean for you to be white? What does it mean for you to have a race? Even though we know it's not real, right? But whether it's your research, your practice, your advocacy, it's the first thing people are seeing, right? So what does it mean? And I'm connecting this, I wrote about all these things in the Racial Healing Handbook, right? But these are things so relevant to this moment. And I go back to Laura's question, which was really like, how can white folks meaningfully take action right now? White folks, I'm speaking directly to you right now. I know we want to get, really escalated in these times, right? About we have to do something. But I want you to slow down and really think about what has been the impact on your life as a white person in human resources development, right? Research, most of you, I know, who have been able to move through mostly schools and institutions and families where you didn't have to think about your race. As someone who's adjacent to whiteness, I can't say that I've never think about my race. I think about my race very daily. But on the other hand, there's a lot of privilege that comes from having light skin. And so now I'm talking to my siblings on this call who are people of color, who are not black, right? we immediately internalize anti-Black racism because we have a vertical system that Resmaa Menakem talks about, where you've got white supremacy, white folks on top, and you've got Black folks as the antithesis to whiteness, positioned on the bottom. Black folks are not inferior, we know that, but that's the system. And so when that vertical system is set up, Resmaa Menakem, who wrote a wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hand, says this vertical system of white supremacy then blows out across the bodies of people of color, where people of color internalize anti-Black racism. So, I'd really love to hear from folks about how, if you identify as white, what does that mean? What are the losses you've had as a result of being raised to not think about your race, to not think about how people experience you? And I think this gets into a lot of what's going on right now in the protest and the righteous uprising, is that, there are a lot of well-meaning white folks wanting to do stuff right now. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is the #1 bestseller on the New York Times list, right? So white folks can read all day, and Laura is sharing about her background, right? And saying that it's allowed you to ignore privilege and in life and work, and also working hard to undo that. I think to be white in our society means that you don't have to think about anti-Black racism, and that is the power of this moment. Black folks, you've seen this on social media left and right, they're saying, like, I am not okay. I am exhausted. I don't want to teach you anymore. And that goes for people of color who are not Black too. And thank you, Carol, for sharing. As a white person, I know I've lived most of my life in ignorance. Yeah, I think ignorance, and I would add disconnection. And thank you for adding Resmaa's book. You can get his book. It's sold out as well, but you can get it directly from his website. So it's painful to think about that ignorance that many of us as people of color and who are white have lived in for most of our life. So as we slow down to really think about our race and the impact of that, we start to get a lot more capacity to make change, right? So I think this moment, there's a bit of a trick going on right now. It's like, hurry up, white folks, and say something, say something. Jamie's joining in on the chorus, like it's a learning journey. But on the other hand, there can be a rush to action without intentionality. And so I feel that even in myself, in my professional work, this is work that I do for a paid living. My work is around diversity, equity, inclusion, but I really see it as freedom and liberation. But if I really want to reduce the harm of anti-Black racism, and if I'm really working to support Black liberation, I have to think about my race and think about and reteach myself the history of racism, right? Which is like the third racial healing strategy I talk about in the Racial Healing Handbook, is like, once you've slowed down and thought about what your race is, right? And that there's a development there, that for white folks, they'll be like, woohoo, I don't have a race, I'm oblivious. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I have a race. And then it's like, wait, I have a race and I'm going to do stuff. I call it the do-gooder stage of white racial identity development. I'm going to do a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to be a good, not racist white person. And then white folks doing that work get a slap on the hand or get hurt or like kind of get called in by Black folks and people of color about their whiteness. And then there's a retreat of white folks and their racial identity development. And so the thing that you can do right now related to your race is not only know that you have a race, but to look for the parts of your journey each day where you want to retreat, right? I'm not saying not to retreat. It's a part of racial identity development. And if you aren't looking actively as white folks about where the retreat is, it's a little bit of a cloaking of, it's the whiteness cloaking yourself in protection, because there's going to be a retreat. As a person of color, I can talk about that identity development. There can be a retreat for me into whiteness too. So anyway, when you start to notice where the retreat, where is the part of people of color, of white folks and of black folks with internalized anti-blackness, right? That's a racial identity development too. How can we learn to identify the places we want to retreat out of the conversation because it's too much to hold, and really learn to notice that in ourselves? Does our throat clench up? Do we feel it in our belly? Do we feel our shoulders going up to our necks? Where do we feel it in our bodies that we want to retreat from these conversations? And Carol, thank you for talking about the white savior. I would encourage you all to really, if you're white or a person of color working on anti-Black racism, look for where that shows up and really honor that. That is a part of you. And we don't want to disconnect the white savior or the person of color savior that's trying to save Black folks. We want to look for where those parts show up in us, right? When that savior shows up in me, I mean, I feel flooded across my chest with I have to do something, I have to do something, I have to do something. But if I'm more solidly grounded in knowing to see that in my body and where that shows up, especially in this moment right now in 2020 on June 12th at 1:26 Eastern time, then we can get busy doing the work of policy and procedure practice change and work with other white and people of color folks to dismantle anti-Black racism and do it in a more intentional way, because there's going to be a lot of distraction right now. So anyway, I can come back to racial identity development, but I hope that part made sense. Knowing you have a race, knowing that you have a racial identity development, but then also looking at how we internalize white supremacy, right? Now, that is for Black folks and people of color as well. How do we internalize that white folks are superior? And if you identify as a person of color or a Black person, I tend to like separate out those identities because of how white supremacy is set up, right? In a vertical structure, white folks on top, Black folks on the bottom, a lie. But in that structure of white supremacy, then that gets blown out across people of color, right? So we all internalize white superiority. And it's so important in our work, in our research, our advocacy and practice and human resources to think about how does that show up? So the thing I want, before we go back to reteaching ourselves history, the third racial healing strategy, I also want to slow down and say, how in your work right now, and I would love to hear from you, how does it show up in your work, the internalized whiteness? And as Ali is saying, whiteness means we have the privilege and freedom not to have to think about it. And we certainly have losses, right? But one of the things we can do right now in this moment is to really get intentional and think, how many ways does anti-Blackness show up in our work? And I think one of the ways it showed up in my work is that there's sometimes I will talk about people of color, including Black folks, and sometimes I won't. And I think the most effective way to dismantle white supremacy is to acknowledge the system, which means we have to acknowledge that Black folks are positioned on the bottom. And that anti-Black racism and racism in general does not affect all people of color in the same way, right? And so when I do interventions, when I do prevention work, I'm making new commitments right now to talk about, when I'm talking about Black folks, I'm talking about Black folks. When I'm talking about people of color, I'm saying Latinx, or I'm saying the words that are a racial ethnic group identifier. For you, how does anti-Blackness show up in your work? How does internalized whiteness show up in your work? And let me just pause and ask you that question and slow us down a little bit. So how does internalized whiteness show up in your body, in your work? Holly's saying it blended, helped her blend in the majority. For Laura, it's class reading, selection, research, design, analysis. That's how internalized whiteness shows up, right? So I think that once we slow down and figure out how internalized whiteness shows up in our work, then we can start to reteach ourselves, right? So in this moment right now, you're going to hear words and phrases that if we've been doing the social justice work before, we've heard them before, right? White supremacy, white privilege, anti-Black racism. But we may be seeing phrases now that feel familiar but are actually still new, and we're trying to wrap our brains around like defund the police, right? Oh, it's good to see you, Wendy. Yeah, theory, and as Aaron is saying, avoid talking about race because we're afraid to use the same terms. Tawana is talking about recruitment, hiring, retention. You all, like, anti-Black racism is so embedded in everything we do in human resources, and everything we do, whether we're Black, white, Latinx, any other racial ethnic identity, Asian Pacific Islander, Native American, that it's so hard to identify it. Tamika is talking about, I don't rock the boat when I'm in white spaces. What would it mean to build an anti-racist human resource development, whether it's association or your classes and your research that was explicitly anti-racist? We don't know. But I think that is the work that is your and our righteous uprising in human resources. We can take to the streets and do that work. But I think you can do it right in your profession as a righteous uprising. An anti-racist human resources, whether it's research or anything else, is going to mean it's not just Tamika rocking the boat. And I don't know everyone's pronouns, but, Tamika is saying I'm scared, or not scared. It may not be fear. Sorry, Tamika, to overlay that. I mean, I don't do it, right? But an anti-racist human resources means that people are rocking the boat all the time in white spaces because we're questioning every moment whiteness. And we're not assuming that it's not there. We're saying, okay, Robin DiAngelo, if you've read White Fragility, I mean, she just talks about these different pillars of white supremacy and white privilege. That, there's this good, bad binary that gets set up in anti-Black racism and white supremacy, where, like, as a white person, you don't want to be called a racist because you don't want to be seen as bad. And that to be good means you're not a racist. Not that you're an anti-racist, right? But this dynamic, she really talks about how it keeps us from even talking about race. And racism isn't an individual act. It's also systemic injustice and anti-Blackness at every turn. And so if we start to recognize this good, bad binary about white supremacy and anti-Black racism, that sets it up so we can't even talk about it, as Aaron was talking about. I can't even talk about it because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Then you realize you just took racism off the table to ever talk about it in human resources. So what I look for is, I think something that's happening in this moment is I look for the maladjustment in my life to whiteness and internalized whiteness. If I'm not feeling that maladjustment, I am certainly not reducing the harm of anti-Black racism. If, as Tawana is talking about, like, people focusing on saying the right things and then doing the right things, if I'm not doing that, if I'm doing that to be perfect, I'm lost. I mean, that's a pillar of white supremacy. Quantity over quality, perfectionism. Just do a little Google search on all, like, white supremacy culture. To build an anti-racist human resources field, it means to think about our races every day, every one of us. It's the number one racial healing strategy I wrote about in this book. I was like, where am I going to start writing about racial healing? And I was like, who am I as Annalise Singh to like even think I have anything to say? But I think as Tamika is sharing, like I also think about my race every day, not because I don't have light skin privilege, but because I had to. In an interracial family as a child, I mean, it was just before my cognitive frontal lobe was developing, where I had critical understandings about what was happening. I saw my dad beat up. I saw him called the N-word, called the terrorists. I experienced those words as a child growing up before I had critical thinking to be like, oh, like this is anti-Black racism that's happening to your immigrant dad. And so what that means is in my hindbrain, I have memories. And if you punched into your brain, which I don't want you to do, go directly in there, you get deep into where our memory banks are stored. We have very, very deep memories and understandings of race. You know, babies have, research has shown that babies understand race as early as 6 months, and that you get in the 2 to 3 year old range, babies, toddlers have already learned anti-Black racism. Thank you, Tawana, for, if you haven't seen the white supremacy list from Serge, just print it out and post it in your workplace so you can dismantle it every freaking day. It's a powerful list. It has helped me get my life, I don't want to say right, but I think more real. But coming back to our memory banks and kind of what I was sharing about my race, even though today, in terms of active harm and loss related to my race, I am not Black. I am a light-skinned person of color. I am white adjacent. So there's so many ways I could not think about my race, and those are going to show up. But I think one of the reasons I do think about my race quite a bit is because what happened in my hindbrain and deep into my memory banks growing up. And so for each of you, you know, I want to speak to my Black siblings and community members especially. We have some internalized trauma around race. And I guess I want to also talk to my folks of color who aren't Black too. You know, there was that moment we had when we realized we had a race, and it freaking hurts. Like when we experience racism, and we know it's not just individual acts, but systems are made of individual acts, right? And so that hurtness we have is really about that second racial healing strategy I talk about in the Racial Healing Handbook, which is about finding the ways we've internalized whiteness and uprooting it every way we can, challenging it, and getting in community about it. I consider myself a pretty empowered South Asian mixed race, white adjacent person around race. I feel like I've talked about my race. I need to build that muscle all the time. And so I feel proud of my race. I feel grounded in it. But I also, there's so many layers about how I got harmed, but also how I have privilege, and I've got to think about that. And so for white folks, it's the same thing. Your grief is going to be more around loss. And so I want to tie grief and I want to tie neurobiology together. So in the beginning of this Facebook Live, we talked about like we have a race. Race is a lie, and we've got a race. We've got these external features that trick us into thinking people have some type of racial group affinity. And let me say, it's a system. So when I say it's a trick, it's like a intentional system that was set up. But then we went into internalization, and that this moment right now that we're in with righteous uprisings led by Black communities over generations, we've had that conversation so far. Now I'm bringing neurobiology and grief in. Okay. So I want each of you to really think about how grief around racism shows up in your life, and grief specifically about anti-Black racism. Now, I know in like racial healing and racial justice, and especially white privilege work, we talk about white women's tears a lot. We're like, oh my gosh, like you start talking about race, and then the white woman cries, and then we're all taking care of her. And it completely distracts the conversation. I get that. I do think that white women's tears can be powerful and stop conversations about race. And I think in this moment that we're in right now, where we saw something very visceral, horrific, brutal, we saw David Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck. And this is a trigger warning for our Black community members. If you do not want to hear this part, just mute me or step away for a moment, because I'm just going to make the connection to lynching. So I just want to give a trigger warning. For the rest of us, we need to sit with this pain. So when we saw David's knee go down on George Floyd's neck, slowing you down, white folks and people of color, so we can remember that. I think there was something collective that happened in all of us, Black folks included, and we said, no. We said, we've seen this before. It's encoded. I talked to you about neurobiology in the hindbrain, and if we could reach into the middle part of our brain, into the memory banks, there's intergenerational trauma. Yes, Tamika, I really want you to be taking care of yourself. And Tamika, I just, and for all of us, as I talk about some racial triggering content, I want you to pay attention to where this is coming up in your body, because this is grief and it's trauma. And so part of me wants to save us all from this. And the other part of me is we've got to turn in and look and grieve intentionally. If as we're getting triggered, you need to rage, I want you to scream. If as you think of that incident and Breonna Taylor being murdered, and how messed up that we have no knock warrants, and how the roots of the police are in the slave patrols, and how when his knee went down on George Floyd's neck, there's intergenerational white body supremacy, encoded. I mean, there are white folks in this call, including me, the white side of my family, that watched lynchings as children, as adults, as celebration. And that gets passed down through not our DNA, but some of the expressions of our DNA through trauma, which is what Resmaa Menakem talks about. So you have got to get this book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Our Bodies. I think Erin's going to put it in the box. You can do the Racial Healing Handbook. You can do as intentional, like moving through practices that are very important, but you've got to pair it with this work. Because you can read White Fragility and you can read How to Be an Anti-Racist all day, and they're important books. I want you to read those. But we've got to do the hardcore practices that help us realize where the trauma lives in our bodies. And that's that trigger, right? That's the grief. So I'm going to say it one more time, and then I'm going to back out of this more somatic work we're doing. That's inspired by Resmaa Menakem, by the way. But when you think about, George Floyd being murdered, where he cried out for his mama. I mean, just think about that. Some people have said mothers got activated around the whole world when he cried out for his mom. And think about the nonchalant way that David murdered him, with his hands in his pockets. And, Holly's talking about intergenerational trauma. Yes, notice as I said those things, where that came up in your body. Tamika's saying my chest, my throat. So again, this is inspired by Resmaa Menakem, one of my heroes. But for Tamika, it's like a hand on a chest and a hand on your throat, gently offering some support. For some of you, you may feel it in your head right now. I can't take it. Take your hands and just place them gently on your head. Maybe it's your shoulders. Maybe it's your belly. Yes, Holly, it was 100% a murder, and I appreciate those of us who are talking about that. Place your hands on these parts of the body because intergenerationally, as Resmaa Menakem talks about, there was so much trauma that got built up that didn't get discharged. And so we don't even know right now in this moment of righteous uprisings if the trauma that's coming up, for instance, in Tamika and other people's bodies, we don't know if that's our trauma or if it's like our great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother's granddaddy's trauma. And as Resmaa reminds us, and as all traumatologists reminds us, intergenerational trauma, it doesn't, your DNA is not defective. I don't want people of color, and even white folks and black folks, I don't want us to think that we're defective, our DNA is defective. But what happens with trauma is the expression of that gets, the field of epigenetics teaches us that the expression of that DNA gets tweaked. It's how we get higher health disparities. My dad saw partition. He saw, because of colonization, he saw people ripped apart, murdered, raped in front of him as like a child. That didn't change the DNA I have, but it definitely, the trauma shaped his ability to talk to me about race. When I saw him attacked around his race, he would be like, beta, which is a Punjabi Hindi word for endearment, like baby. He was like, they don't know what they do. He was trying to protect me, right? And so our families have tried to protect people, especially Black communities, around race and racism, which is why people learn, like, who are Black and people of color, not to talk about race in front of white folks. White folks, people of color, if we want to build an anti-racist human resources, we've got to take the lead in saying we're going to build an anti-racist human resources field. That means we're going to talk about race. We're going to be maladjusted. We're going to be disturbed because this is intergenerational trauma we're dealing with. And then we've got to give ourselves permission to grieve, which is, again, that connection between neurobiology and grief, which is our bodies do things. White women's tears are going to stop a conversation about race, but they also have to come, and the conversation needs to continue. If we're not crying, raging, fearful, we're not grieving. And that's, I think, the number 4 racial healing strategy I talk about in the Racial Healing Handbook is we want to get really good at knowing how the grief shows up, including the denial. When folks were chiming in, like, okay, as people of color, you just know not to talk about certain things in white spaces. Denial bargaining. An anti-racist human resources says, we don't have people of color and Black people, Indigenous people teach us about racism, but sure as heck, when they share their experiences, we not only believe them, but we make policy and procedure changes. And not only do we not make the Black people, the Indigenous people, the people of color and human resources educate us, we go back and reteach us the history of racism. And we get busy tracing those policies and procedures, we're going to change right away. And this brings me to the 3rd racial healing strategy of reteaching yourself about race and racism. One thing you can do right now, whether you're white, Black, Indigenous, a person of color, whether you're in the land we now call the United States or someone else around the globe, is just learn the history of race and racism and how it got set up. My go-to book to do that is a very thick book called Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Ibram Kendi. And there's a remix that just came out with Jason Reynolds. That's a youth adult book. But I think one of the things that Dr. Kendi really talked about, and I talk about his work in the Racial Healing Handbook, is that if I were to ask you how racism started, anyone know? Anyone want to chime in with how it started? We don't get taught how it started. You know, it started with Prince Henry, like way back in Portugal and Spain. And it's why, yeah, I won't go off on a rant on Latinx, but within every racial ethnic group, there's a colonization group too, right? And the Spanish colonized, the Portuguese colonized. And so from the beginning of time, humans have enslaved human people because humans can suck. But what happened with Prince Henry is he made it so that Black folks were the ones you wanted to enslave because they were easier to identify. Not because there's anything wrong with Black communities. Black people are the birthplace of all humankind, you know, which is why there's so much Black excellence, joy, and resistance and resilience in the world, and why white folks and other people of color want to co-opt Black culture at every turn. But that might be another Facebook Live. But my point is, reteaching yourself about the history of race and racism means that you know the history of how racism got started around the globe, how it gets tweaked in terms of colonization, how people of color who aren't Black benefit from anti-Blackness, take on values of individualism. And I'm not going to talk about anti-Black racism or advocate for Black communities. I mean, I don't have to go very far in my own history on my Indian side to find colonization. I go back one generation. On my mom's, I go several. But white supremacy, the impact is the same. It's an internalized felt feeling of superiority. And so I think, one of the questions I'm getting a lot right now from specifically white folks is, what can I do? What can I do? And Peter, thank you for sharing about the conquest of Texas. That's exactly what you want to be doing, is looking at the very recent history. And no, of course, history in general. But one of the things white folks can do right now is really sit. We just sat with the pain of George Floyd. We didn't even sit with Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin. White folks can sit with the pain of internalized felt superiority and then grieve that. Learn to identify where the grief is showing up as stuckness. I'm afraid. I don't want to move forward. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Hell, if you aren't saying the wrong thing as a white person, you aren't doing the work. As a person of color who's not Black, I don't celebrate the times I do harm in anti-Black racism, but I'm sure like building a muscle to look at it, not do an over apology, apologize, and move forward with dismantling anti-Black racism. But I can only do that if I've sat with the pain. So I just wanted to connect neurobiology and grief in a way that we can remember that when we are grieving, we don't know if it's past grief related to past intergenerational trauma, whether we're Black, Indigenous, people of color, or white. I mean, one of the things Resmaa Menakem really does so well is he talks about in white communities, I mean, white bodies brought white body supremacy over to the land we call the US because there was all this rape. I mean, think about Game of Thrones, torture, think about the medieval times. People delighted in torture. So read Resmaa's book for that piece. but also do the exercises in the Racial Healing Handbook, and keep teaching yourself about history, because it's the intergenerational trauma that is paired with our current experience of our hindbrain and how we've been taught in the system of the false system of white body supremacy, with white folks on top and black folks on the bottom, and anti-black racism blowing out across people of color, as Resmaa Menakem talks about. That's the thing that we work on identifying more, not if it happens, but where it happens. For some of you, it's going to be where you turn to black people in your life for comfort. No, stop. Not their job. That's intergenerational comfort. We should 100% as people of color and white folks not look to black folks for comfort or education. If you're white or a person of color, we've got to look at how our histories of immigration, whether it's forced or chosen, of colonization, really are deep down in ourselves, and how white supremacy, it kills people. And in the killing of black communities, physically, mentally, spiritually, that blood is in our cells. We have blood in our cells that kills people. And again, you may have felt something come up that's like, oh my gosh, I don't know if my body can hold that. Just notice where it's in your body. Offer some physical support, as Resmaa teaches us, to that part of your body. Just notice. It's pain. It's grief. It's our neurobiology. It's intergenerational racism. It's why you can't just get out there and start doing something about racism right away. You got to go internal, but then connect that personal intergenerational work to policy and procedure change. And I know we just got 3 more minutes to go here, but kind of where I want to end it are some next steps you can do. There are these things called equity indicators. You can Google that. Do the statistical modeling of the demographics of where you're working right now, or your research, or like if you're in practice and joining us, like the demographics of what you know about your human workforce. Do some modeling about how long it's going to take for black folks and people of color to have pay equity. You can do the gender overlay too. Definitely do that. Do a first generation college student overlay too. But then you're going to see, like, that might take another 400 years at this rate to get pay equity. No. I'm going to set an equity indicator right now and do policy and procedure change, because as Ibram Kendi, Dr. Ibram Kendi teaches us, we can talk about love and feelings all day, but this is about structural change. And so those equity indicators give you an idea. You've got like 1 Latinx person and 3 black folks in your area. What would it look like? What needs to happen to get black people in the numbers that they are demographically existing in your area? It seems hard, but you all, this work is strategic. It's been laid down before us. All we have to do is pick it up. It's not new. It's going to entail grieving. It's going to entail, like, for white folks, looking at where your felt superiority is at every moment. And for people of color and black people, how we've internalized white body supremacy. And that if we just change something about us, will be enough for white folks. No. Black community members, you do not need me to apologize for racism, but I'm going to. And I commit the rest of my life, not in a savior mode, because black communities do not need me to save them. Like, that is not my job or their job. But it is my responsibility to look at where felt superiority and white comfort shows up in every part of my life. And I'm going to do that every day until my last breath. So, I mean, as we wind our time down together, I just want to say, like, let's be uncomfortable. Let's be maladjusted, as Dr. King said. You know, we should be maladjusted to capitalism, racism, militarism. He said that to the American Psych Association. You know, Dean Spade said, let's be gentle with ourselves and each other and fierce as we end oppression and fight to end it. Let's specifically look at anti-Black racism. And I think, you know, where I'll leave things is really let's dare to love in the process. Let's kind of see how the truest and deepest form of love we can share in our lifetime is to dismantle white body supremacy, find out where it lives in us, and reduce all the harm that we can. Which means to be in community with one another and to dare to say there can be some love and joy and pleasure in the process, as Adrienne Marine Brown talks about. She says if you're engaging in activism and you're not experiencing pleasure and joy, the joy of the work, you know, just kind of check yourself and have some conversations with your accountability partners. So anyway, it has been an awesome, awesome time to be with you all. I hope, as Arundhati Roy says, the pandemic is a portal, and it's a portal to a world where we reduce the harm of anti-Black racism. We understand that Black communities, as the Association for Black Psychology said, you know, for Black communities, your protest is your breath. There's nothing more for you to do. It's time for people of color and white folks to get to work. So, sending you all love, encourage you to think about love in your life as connected to justice and liberation. So, to each of you, I say I love you. I'm wishing you much intentionality, joy, and maladjustment on the journey. Because when we do those things, it has meaning. All right. Look forward to connecting with you soon. Take good care. Bye.